Okay, great stuff. Right, so today I'm going to be talking about a tool that I've been working on for about a year and a half now. It's called Cape. I'll wait for these last few to come in. Okay, so the malware Cape. As I said, this is a project I've been working on for about a year and a half now. So I'll start off by just going over the proposed agenda for this talk. The first thing we'll talk about is the problem we're trying to solve, and then we'll have a quick look at the current solutions for tackling this problem. Then I'll introduce my solution for this problem, Cape. We'll look at a few examples, and then I'll open up for some questions at the end. So nice and simple. A bit of background. So my name is Kevin O'Reilly. I work at Context Information Security. I work in incident response. So that means that we often have to deal with incidents of malware infections on clients. Often these are intrusions by advanced persistent threat or state-sponsored actors, which can be very exciting and interesting stuff. The most exciting of which for me would be the malware analysis, since that's what I enjoy doing with my time. However, it does require that. It requires a lot of time and it requires a lot of skills. So when we're under pressure and need to get answers fast, then often malware analysis can become quite a chore. And in the market of threat intelligence, there's one thing that everybody wants quickly, and that's their indicators of compromise, so they can be disseminated and ingested by all the systems that ingest them. So the question is, why are these IOCs hard to get to? The problem really is that the bad guys don't want you to get to them. The malware creators try to obfuscate basically two things: the payload, which is in other words the functionality of the malware, and the configuration, which is the things such as the domain names that maybe the malware will connect back to, or IP addresses, things that like the installation directory or the names of the services that it might create. All of these things are the configuration of the malware and can vary from one example of a given piece of malware to another. But those are the things that we're really interested in getting to when we're tasked with a new malware infection. So to look into the problem in a bit more detail, I'm going to quickly go through a few examples of ways in which malware does try and hide from you those payloads and configuration. Oh, here we are. Okay, so the first example is something called DLL Side loading. I won't go into too much detail here. If you haven't heard of this, then this may not be enough for you to understand necessarily what's going on, but it's a concept that involves taking a legitimate executable. So the malware authors are trying to basically get past your not only their AV protection, but they're also, of course, trying to obfuscate their payloads. And they achieve this by taking a legitimate executable and packaging the malware with that. They accompany the malware with a DLL, which is modified, but looks for the most part to be the same DLL that the executable is expecting to be there, but it has a slight modification. And then there is a third file, which we call the payload file, which actually contains all of the interesting functionality of the malware and its configuration. So in a case of malware of this type, you would end up with three files. The first of which is a legitimate file, as I said. The second of which doesn't really have any malicious functionality in it. It could be detected by an AV vendor, perhaps, because it has a small modification. But that modification only serves to load the third file, which is essentially an encrypted blob containing the payload, executable, and the configuration. Another example being a lot of malware will try and load further modules in memory rather than loading a new DLL as a typical application might do. It doesn't want to use Windows functions to load the module, so it will unpack it and load it itself in memory, trying to avoid behavioral detection systems and just trying to generally be stealthy. Another example that we see in some APT malware families is that they store modules in places like the registry. So they can create a registry key, encrypt the malware payload, and store it in there. Often they do that to enable the payload to pass between processes or by files, and we'll see an example of some malware that does that in a short while. Now, I don't know if you've heard of process injection. It's quite a big method, or a number of methods that malware often use in order to get their code running in processes that aren't their own. So a malware sample may inject code into another process that's legitimate, perhaps such as explorer.exe. It may inject some shellcode, so it's just a blob of its own code that will do its thing. When run, it may inject a whole DLL or whole module into the address space of the target process. Or it may do the most complex thing, but probably the most powerful, if you like, of these techniques, which is called process hollowing. Some other people refer to it as RunPE. This basically works where the malware will create a new process out of a legitimate Windows file, often svchost.exe or something like that. Now, it creates the process in a suspended state, so the process never actually runs, and the malware then overwrites the process image with an image of its own payload. And once it's done that, it then allows the process to run, and thus what looks like a legitimate process to Windows, and perhaps to anyone looking, is actually a malicious process, and is thus hidden, and also can gain privileges that the Windows executable it's overwritten would have had, such as firewall access and the like. And of course, there's a big area that's been part of the the war between the security vendors and malware creators for some years, is the area of packers or executable, executable compression and encryption, basically a way in which an executable can be packaged such that its code and its configuration are held within, and only when it's run does it decrypt and decompress itself and ultimately let the real payload run. And of course, a lot of malware likes to roll its own sort of cryptography to encrypt itself and use its own functions and the like. All of these can present problems to the analyst when trying to get through these levels of protection in order to try and get to what we're interested in, of course, the payloads and the configuration. So, what are the current solutions to solving this problem? There is manual analysis. You can do the extraction manually. So we'll talk about how that's done in a little bit, and of course, the alternative being relying on an automated system. And you can probably guess that I'm building up to something on that subject. So let's first look at the manual approach. How would you go about extracting the payloads and the configuration from malware using the tools of a malware lab? So you probably would start with a virtual machine, or a machine that you can easily re-image that's isolated from the internet, of course, on which you can run your malware. But you want to have some tools to run it so that you can measure its behavior. That's, in other words, called dynamic analysis. So a number of tools that you might want to use to observe the behavior of malware when it's running include an API monitor, for example. This is something that will log all the API calls that the malware makes to the system and gives you a good idea, if you can capture this, of what it's up to. If you can't get a good enough idea with just the API calls and you want to dive a bit deeper, a much more powerful tool is a debugger, which allows you to step through the code of the malware one instruction at a time, and allows you to set breakpoints on areas of interest, perhaps code that's going to execute, or perhaps an area of memory you suspect will be read or written to. You can cause the debugger to catch that behavior and present you with the code around that point, and that's where you might find the bit that you're interested in. Once you've got to the part that you're interested in, usually then you want to save it to disk ultimately, and that's a process called dumping. So once you've led the malware through to the point where it's doing the interesting stuff, perhaps it's unpacked its payload, or it's just about to read its configuration from an area of memory, that might be a good opportunity for you to take a dump of that memory area or the executable as it's unpacked and save it to file. And finally, one of the other things that often comes up in manual analysis is that once you've loaded a process, it will go through a process when it loads of importing a load of functions from the Windows DLLs that it depends upon. And this is a kind of a one-way process, in so much as if you dump the executable from memory, you'll find that the imports are no longer easily intelligible from the dump. But that really can be a hindrance to static analysis, because you can't necessarily see which of the Windows functions the malware was trying to call at a given moment, and thus its functionality can be obscured. So it's often a goal of static analysis, or sorry, dynamic analysis first, to perform import reconstruction on a dumped binary in order to put those imports back in place, such that when you do get to static analysis and you fire it up into a disassembler, you can see all the unpacked code with the proper API calls. Finally, once you've got to that point, if you've happened to have dumped some configuration data, it's probably just a memory blob with different fields. You might want to create a tool to parse this in order to pull out the details you're interested in. Okay, so moving on to automated analysis, the sorts of things that are currently available to tackle this sort of problem include a number of proprietary solutions, including the following list. Now, the problem with these is, of course, that they're proprietary, first of all, so you can't necessarily see how they work. It's usually a website that you would log on to and submit a sample to, but once you've submitted the sample, you don't necessarily know what's going on behind the scenes. You can't necessarily control it or influence it. And actually, these systems tend to be designed for the end consumer, if you like. That might be someone who wishes to get the IOCs as quickly as they can into a system or whatever. They just ultimately want to get to the end goal, but if the system doesn't get you there, then there's no in between. So moving on to open source and free options, which of course are much more favored by myself. There is a site called Malware, based on the open source and free malware analysis platform Cuckoo. There are other systems out there on the internet that you can submit samples to, such as hybridanalysis.com. But ultimately, the number one open source and free automated malware analysis system in existence today is a project called Cuckoo, which you may or may not have heard of, but hopefully I can give you a little bit of an intro into what it is. So I'd say that there are two notable forks of Cuckoo on the internet at the moment. There is the original fork, which is on GitHub at that address there, Cuckoo Sandbox. But there's another fork that was created by a chap called Brad Spengler, who used to work at Accuvant. Then they became Optiv, and I think he's since parted company with them and moved his repository to the address on the screen. But ultimately, this fork of Cuckoo is, in my opinion, superior to the main fork because it brings a whole raft of new functionalities and brought it earlier, such as 64-bit analysis and a whole other slew of things that I won't go into right now. But I will give you a quick demo of Cuckoo in action, so that I can show its virtue as well as hopefully talking about its limitations and thus presenting the stage really for what I want to talk about next, which is my addition to Cuckoo Cape. So time for the first video. So this is just, I've taken a PDF that was published by Sophos called the Rotten Tomato Campaign. It includes a number of examples of APT documents that came from China that contain exploits and ultimately plug-X malware. You can see the hash and the name of the file at the bottom of the screen there. And there is the file itself. So I've got hold of that file from VirusTotal, and I'm going to load up the Cuckoo interface and submit the file to Cuckoo for analysis. So I'm just selecting the file here and selecting a Windows 7 virtual machine to run it on, submit the job, and normally we'd have to wait here for a few minutes for the analysis to complete, but by the wonders of modern technology we see it's already finished. So we can have a look at the analysis. I'll have to step over here so I can see this a bit. We can see the screen of the malware running. The document has opened. Down to the bottom right-hand side of the screen you can also see hopefully, well, it may have been there, the domain name that was the malware called to, and now you can see the process tree, and I'm highlighting there the RAS-TLS process that was ultimately the legitimate process that then loaded the modified DLL, that then loaded the payload file. But unfortunately, in Cuckoo's analysis, we do see in the drop files, we can find the payload file and the DLL, but ultimately there's not much more than the fact that those files were dropped. In the behavioral analysis, we see the API logs, and if we look deep in there, we'll ultimately find the point at which the executable loads the DLL, the point at which the DLL loads the payload, and we might, if we're lucky, see some API calls that refer to the extraction of the payload and of the configuration. But ultimately, Cuckoo doesn't really tell us much more than that. So hopefully we can now switch back to the slides. Okay. So this brings me on to CAPE, which stands for Config and Payload Extraction, and hopefully it does exactly that. I am a big fan of Cuckoo, like I say, but I ultimately want to just get to those. As an analyst, I'm not expecting Cuckoo to do absolutely everything for me, necessarily. I would like to get to the malware payload so that I can have a look at it myself in a disassembler, and ultimately I would like to see the configuration if possible and get to the point where that's decrypted in memory so that I can know things that the malware might have done that might not have necessarily done in the sandbox. So one of the things about sandboxes is they can be a little bit tricky to get working, and sometimes the malware doesn't play ball. It doesn't always call out to the command and control domain, and it may have more than one command and control domain. If it has a series in its configuration and it only calls on one at the time that you run it in the sandbox, then you'll only ever see that one. So we need hopefully a better solution than this. So ultimately, starting from Cuckoo, I decided I wanted to see if I could add to it from all those techniques and tools that we discussed in the malware analysis process. So API hooking, dumping, the import reconstruction, debugging, and static parsing. So the first one being API hooking. Well, we saw that in the analysis there from Cuckoo, we had an API log. So this functionality is already present in Cuckoo. But we can make more of it. There's an opportunity when API calls are made, if they happen to be, for example, decompressing a module from memory, the return from that call might be an opportunity to take that decompressed buffer and dump it to file. That might be what we're after. So we can add that sort of functionality to Cuckoo, and we can add additional hooks for functions that haven't been already included in Cuckoo, but that might be interesting to us that the malware uses. So as I said, that there's an opportunity for us to extract the payloads from many API calls. But short of if we're not able to get to the bit we're interested in through API calls, then we need something a bit more powerful. And as we talked about in the manual analysis section, the most powerful tool, really, the next thing to step to is the debugger. A debugger is a very powerful tool, and I've added one to Cuckoo, as you probably guessed. And although it's powerful, I've hoped to make it nice and simple to use. It gives you the ability to control the malware execution on the level of the instructions, allows you to set breakpoints, and up to 4 of them per thread, of every thread the malware has. And you can use those breakpoints to detect the reading of a memory area, writing to a memory area, or the execution of code in a memory area. And you can also put the processor into a mode called single-step mode, where it will execute a single instruction and then pass back control to the debugger. So the combination of those techniques makes for a very, very powerful way of manipulating the malware. Once you get to the breakpoint that you've set, you might want to dump a payload or a configuration at that point. You may want to set further breakpoints, so you can, in fact, set a chain of breakpoints until you get to the point you're interested in, or you may want to clear existing breakpoints that have already tripped. And you can set in the debugger, you can set the initial breakpoints by using Yara signatures, or you can set them in API hooks, for example, if you know that the malware will call an API first, then you can, in the hook for that, you can then set a breakpoint and carry on the sequence that way. This is all implemented in the monitor DLL, which is the way in which Cuckoo works. Ultimately, the DLL is injected into the malware process and monitors all its behavior. So the DLL that I've made, I've integrated into that, hopefully for simple use and so that it doesn't change much the model that Cuckoo uses. So, as I said, an opportunity can be gained from the debugger to get to the point and dump what you're after. So that brings us on to the next bit of functionality, the dumping. We want to perhaps dump areas from memory that contain configuration data. We want to dump maybe some shellcode that's been injected into a process. We might want to dump an entire module that's been decrypted or decompressed in memory. And so to do this, well, the memory region dumping was quite simple, as it would probably seem. But when it came to dumping PE modules, well, I could have tried to implement it myself, but there's already some tools existing in open source that I thought I might be able to make use of. And funnily enough, one of them is actually a tool that I would tend to use in the manual process. So not only can I use it for manual analysis, but because it's an open source project, it's called Scylla, I believe that's how it's pronounced. It's an open source project written in C++, and it copes with both 32 and 64 processes, so it was perfect candidate for integration into CAPE. So that is what I did. But the other beauty of this tool, Scylla, is it's not just for dumping, it also performs import reconstruction. So we can rebuild the imports from the modules that we've dumped. As I said before, it allows you to see those functions when you analyze the dump binary, and it's the best way to get as closely back to the original binary as possible. So again, the original tool for this was something called Import Reconstructor, or imprec. That's a project that's no longer maintained, unfortunately, but because of the fact that it's no longer maintained and was closed source, that spurred on the creators of Scylla to go on and create Scylla, which is fortuitous for my purposes, as I've been able to take the open source code, integrate it into CAPE, and thus gain the functionality both of dumping and import reconstruction. Okay, so now I'm going to take you through a little demo of CAPE in action, and I'm going to use the same malware sample that we saw a moment ago, the plugx sample from the Sophos Rotten Tomato campaign. Okay, so just loading up the CAPE interface. As you can see, it's ultimately the same interfaces as Cuckoo. Just load up the document. Choose the Windows 7 virtual machine and submit. So as again, by the wonders of technology, we should be able to fast forward pretty quickly to the analysis. So the interesting thing to notice here, it's ultimately the same as a typical Cuckoo run, but you can see among the signatures there's a number of detections, the most important of which is just the plugx detection. So CAPE has detected that plugx has run here based on API calls. We can see the malware's run the same way as before. But if that detection has caused the job to be resubmitted, so if we go back to the main screen, at the top here we'll see that there are two jobs. There was the original document on its own, but there's now a second job that's CAPE plugx doc package. So that was automatically resubmitted using this package, which is specifically built to extract the payload and configuration from plugx. So if we go to the CAPE tab, we can see there that is the configuration extracted from memory and then parsed. So we can see the command and control address as well as other indicators of compromise, such as service names and the processes that it's going to use. And then at the bottom there we have the payload DLL, which is unpacked, ready to download and ready to be fed into your disassembler in order to be able to see its full functionality without any obfuscation whatsoever. Okay, so moving back to the slides. Okay, so that was an example of DLL side loading, as I mentioned earlier. There are quite a number of malware families that use that. A number of Chinese APT families, such as HTTP Browser 9002 RAT, use this technique. All we have to do to dump this in CAPE is to put hooks on the relevant functions. The payload is decompressed in memory by an API function called RTL decompress buffer, and the configuration is copied using the memcopy function. So just by hooking those two functions and adding appropriate code to detect the things that we're interested in, we can dump the payload and config. Once we've done that, we then use a parser, a Python parser, to parse the configuration and thus process it in order to be presented in the graphical interface. So the demo we've already seen. So I just want to quickly go through the techniques that ultimately I listed in the beginning of the different ways in which malware might obfuscate itself and what CAPE's answer is for those techniques. So in the case of extracting or loading modules in memory, with an API hook we can detect any of the memory allocation functions. If they allocate memory that's executable, we might know that something's up. So we can detect on that, and then we can add a breakpoint to the hook, if you like, for the memory creation that says, okay, we've just created some new memory that's not been written to yet, but it's executable. We know, therefore, that it's likely to be written to with executable code, possibly some shellcode or an extracted module. So we can put a breakpoint on that area to detect writing to it, which is what the malware is bound to do next. And if the malware does write a PE module, we can detect that by virtue of its MZ and PE headers, and we can then set a breakpoint on the entry point of the module. Or in the case of shellcode, it's probably just going to start running straight from from address 0, if you like. So we can put a breakpoint on execution on that address as well. And if either of those breakpoints are tripped, we know the malware is executing that code, and we have an opportunity there to dump that module. Going to the example of storing modules in the registry or file system, an example of malware that does this is EvilGrab, a Chinese APT malware. It chooses to encrypt and store its modules in the registry, so it calls reg set value ex and it stores the encrypted module in there, but that provides us with the API hooks on that call an opportunity to dump the module once we've decrypted it, but that's a relatively trivial bit of decryption. So I've got a quick video here just to show you the EvilGrab in action. I haven't bothered to go through the whole process of submitting it this time. We can just go back and see I've submitted a job there, second from top, EvilGrab with no package in the beginning. We'll scroll down, we'll see it's been detected by a signature that's based on its registry creation as EvilGrab. We'll have a quick look here in the API calls. If we filter them by registry entries, we can scroll down and we can see the call that creates that writes the module to the registry. So that is the encrypted module being written to the registry. It's been encrypted by a single byte XOR key. So that's no good to us as it would appear in Cuckoo, but luckily it's triggered a second submission with an EvilGrab package, and here we have the CAPE output, which includes a number of bits of shellcode that it's also injected, but it also includes 2 PE modules, one of which, of course, is the module that it was storing in the registry, which is its main functionality. So we're just going to quickly download that. And we can, I think, load it up in a disassembler in order to see its full functionality. Okay, so moving back to the slides. Okay, so the next malware technique that we'll look at, or group of techniques, if you like, is the injection. So I mentioned before that shellcode and DLL injection are commonly used. There are so many examples of malware that does this. It really is a very, very common technique indeed. We can dump anything that's injected by putting API hooks on the creation and memory functions and using them as an opportunity to dump. So if we detect the use of functions like virtual alloc and write process memory. These are the functions that are used to create the memory region in the target process and then write the code to the target process before finally causing that code to be run by calling create remote thread. Upon the calling of create remote thread, we now know that the malware is about to execute that code in memory, so that is a good time to take a dump of it. And finally, moving on to the more powerful of the injection techniques, the process hollowing, which I described before when creating a suspended process and overwriting it. This has become extremely popular in malware authors in recent times. There are these three examples, Tidal, Terminator, PC Client, among others in APT malware families. There is a huge number of malware families that aren't APT that use this sort of thing. The number of sort of generic malware families and ransomware and the like that uses this is quite significant, and these are things that CAPE unpacks, which I didn't expect actually, but it's just a very, very popular technique, and usually the malware doesn't, by the time it gets to overwriting the target process with the code that it wants to write, it's already unpacked it, so it's a great opportunity for us to get to what we're interested in. So upon the detection of a suspended process being created, we can see it's being written to, and then finally, in order for the malware to run that process, it will either call resume thread or resume process. That's our opportunity to take a dump just before it resumes the code and get the fresh copy of that module before it's run. And finally, we get to things like packers and the custom crypto. An example of this being APT29, the Russian Duke family uses this in some of their variants at least. Well, what they have used is actually a version of UPX, which they've modified and hacked in order that it can't be, that their payloads can't be extracted with the UPX tool. But ultimately, they are UPX underlying everything, and there's a certain way that UPX unpacks its code that we can rely on to get a dump of that code. So the first thing that a UPX executable will do is save the registers that it starts with to the stack while it does its unpacking, and then just before it passes control back to the unpacked code, it reads those values back off the stack again. So if we put a breakpoint on the stack just as the process launches, we can detect that writing. If we then put a breakpoint in the same area for read, we can detect when the malware is finished unpacking and has read those values back. We then have to single step until we detect a big jump, and then we know we're going to be at the original entry point, which is the main target for an unpacker, basically. So we can use that to make an unpacker for hacked UPX samples. So I've got a little demo here. So this is a sample that I mentioned there. It's a Russian variant of some sort of Duke. I'm not sure which. Ultimately, we can see if we look at the, I'll have just run a tool here to display a quick output of the section names. Normally UPX has UPX 0, 1, and 2 as its section names. In this case, they've been changed, so that it's not really a proper UPX file, and we can see this by attempting to extract it by using UPX. We'll see there that there's been an unpacking exception. The UPX tool itself has detected that this is a hacked sample that it can't unpack. So what do? We load up CAPE and we submit the sample using the CAPE UPX package. So scroll down to CAPE UPX, pick our Windows 7 VM and hit submit. Give it a few seconds, and then we go to the output. So we can see there the size of the file in its compressed form. If we go to the CAPE tab, we can now see we have an unpacked version of that file, and it's gone up in size. So we can just download that now and load this up into our favorite tool, the disassembler. So we can now see, if you look at the section tables, there's an extra section on there that Cape's added. That's for the import reconstruction. If we load this executable now up in IDA, we'll see it does have a note. It's detected that it's a dumped file and warns that the imports may be damaged. But we go back to, if we go to the imports tab, we'll see that they're all actually there, and we can use them for cross-references in the code, jumping to whichever part of the code we like, and ultimately proceed with our analysis. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. Okay, so that's ultimately my presentation of Cape, talking about the kind of coverage that I've managed to attain thus far with the project. As I mentioned, I've covered I think 5 techniques of loading modules in memory, decompressing them, the 3 different variants of injection, and I've built a package for hacked UPX. There's also specific malware family packages which I've built. The plugx one we saw, EvilGrab we've seen, ASI is another Chinese malware variant, and there are a few more in development currently. It's worth mentioning things like HTTP browser. This is something that's unpacked by the compression package, but then the configuration is, once the unpacked file is presented by Cape, it's run, Yara is run across the resulting dumps, and if a signature triggers that can detect an unpacked piece of malware, it can then trigger a configuration parser, which then pulls out the relevant details for presentation in the graphical interface. Another thing that I sought to do on building Cape was to try and make it a superset of other projects, if you like. There is another project out there called malwareconfig.com, which has a similar goal to Cape, but it only works statically. So it depends upon being able to pull the indicators of compromise from samples without unpacking them. So they have to be present in plain text in the binary. So not quite the same as Cape, but nonetheless there are interesting malware families that do not bother to actually obfuscate their payloads, and including Sakula, or Sakula, however that's pronounced, which is another Chinese variant. So I saw that among others, among 38 other families were covered by the malwareconfig.com project. Since it's open source, I thought I should integrate it. So I integrated that into Cape and use its functionality to do things like the HTTP browser static parsing once it's been dumped. So I think actually it combines well with Cape and takes it even further. There's another project on the internet called DC3MWCP, stands for Malware Config Parser. So it's a project from the DC3 guys to do the same job, really, to a Python-based configuration parsing project, which I plan to also integrate into Cape in order that people can use either of the 2 possibilities for making static parsers for anything that's dumped by Cape. And as I mentioned, there are several packages in development. So this brings me on to the call for assistance. Hopefully I can get some interest in this project, and if any of you are inclined, you can contribute to the project. I've made Cape hopefully modular and simple to extend. I'm always looking and hoping for new packages to be created for further malware families. Certainly that's an area that there could be a massive increase in the number of specific malware packages that we could create. If there are any novel techniques or techniques that I haven't come across or haven't included yet, they could possibly be added as packages. And of course, packers, there's a myriad of packers out there. I've only really looked at hacked UPX as a kind of test case, but proving that works, hopefully it's wide open now for further packer packages to be added. So the way in which you might go about helping contribute to Cape would involve some coding in C or C++ for the monitor DLL in order to do the API hooks and the breakpoints, and maybe a bit of Python for the config parsing. So to go into a bit more detail about how you might contribute, of course, the API hooks can be added to, the breakpoints can be added to with a simple API. We perform the dumping. Well, this is just really talking about the sort of features that Cape makes available through a simple API in order that you can, a couple of function names there make it really easy for you. If you want to dump a process and fix the imports, it's just a single function call, giving it the argument of the process identifier. Okay, having some difficulty moving on. So the config parsing, as I mentioned before, it's just blobs of memory that need to be parsed. So we've already got the malware config.net parsing engine in Cape, which is based on Python and Yara. I'll be adding the DC3 one soon. And there's also a custom parser. For example, the plugx parsing that you saw in that demo, the parsing wasn't done by me, it was done by a chap called Fabien Perrigot from Airbus. He released that open source for use with volatility plugins, but anything that's been written for volatility, because that involves memory dumps, is ultimately well suited to also being used in Cape, because ultimately Cape is based upon dumping memory. Okay, so as of today, Cape is on GitHub. It's free and open source for you to go and make use of at the following address. I'm also planning to release a series of blogs to describe how it works and its inner functionality in a bit more detail, and some of the challenges that I've had to overcome to implement it. But most importantly, I'll be writing a Cape package development guide in order to help and encourage other people to contribute packages to it. And in the process of making Cape, I couldn't find anywhere on the internet the ability to run Cuckoo on Windows. Cuckoo essentially runs on a Linux machine, but I saw no reason why it couldn't run in a Linux virtual machine and control the host machine virtualization in order to work. And since I couldn't find one anywhere, I've created a machinery module for a VMware workstation, which allows you to run Cuckoo and, of course, Cape on a Windows system, so you could run it on your laptop. And one thing that I'm also hoping to build is a Cape virtual appliance, which will just be a Linux virtual machine with Cape pre-installed that you can just download with a little bit of setup, of course, to configure it with the host virtualizer, the hypervisor. It should all get you working on your Windows laptop, hopefully. And that brings me to the end. So at this point, I'll open up to any questions.